He's also introduced our next plenary speaker, Amy Lightfoot. I'll just say a few words about her. She's the Assistant Director, Schools, English and Skills, Academic in British Council. She leads on academic strategy and quality assurance of British Council teacher education projects and research programs in India. Please join me in welcoming Amy Lightfoot.
So this funny thing happened to me on the way home yesterday after the evening event that Professor Marinas mentioned we had at the British Council. So on my way home, there's a very busy traffic junction that I often get stuck at, and it takes ages for the red light to change. And there's a group of kids who work at those traffic lights. They sell flowers, they sell toys, they ask for money, the usual kind of thing. And over the last couple of years, we started chatting to these kids. To be honest, very selfishly, because it's one of the few opportunities I get to practice my Hindi. But so yesterday, sure enough, sitting in traffic at the traffic light, and I rolled down my window, and the little girl who I often chat to, she must be about 9 years old, she came up and she said in Hindi, "Oh, you're very late today. Where have you been?" And I said back to her, "Daftar," which is actually Urdu, right? But it's used very commonly. And she said, "Office." And I just thought, it's such for everything we've been discussing over the last couple of days, it's such a little micro case study of language use in India and how children use different languages. And this little girl, she's, as I said, she's 9 years old. She comes from a village in Rajasthan. I don't know what her mother tongue is. She doesn't go to school. But there she is. She's using Hindi to speak to me. She's using bits of Urdu that are mixed in. And then she's got this little dictionary of English words that she's picked up. She probably doesn't even know that they're English. But there she is, kind of like navigating through all these languages. So I just thought that was a really nice little thing to think about. Okay, so before I had this serendipitous exchange yesterday, I was going to start with this quote. So I'm just looking, as Theo said, I'm looking at these classroom observations and just talking a little bit in general about what we can tell from classroom observations about multilingual practices in India, but also having a look at some of the initial data that's come in. So I was going to start with this quote. And this actually came from another study that I've been involved in that I did with a colleague who's based at the University of Warwick. And this is taken from a survey, a questionnaire that we gave out. We had about 170 teachers respond to the survey. And it was looking at teachers' use of language in the classroom, self-reported. And on the survey, one of the respondents wrote this. And when we were going through all of the data, I saw it and I was like, yeah, okay, you're right, And it's just a reminder about why classroom observations are so important for any kind of really research that we're trying to do to look and see what teachers do in the classroom. A bit harsh maybe, I'm sure some teachers will tell you the truth about what's happening, but I think it just underlines the reason why classroom observations can be so useful for the type of research that we're doing. Not that they're perfect by any means, but I'll talk about that. There's some of the limitations of them in a moment. Okay, so Theo already just recapped on the purpose of the MultiLila project that we're talking about over these 2 days. And I just wanted to list here very clearly the different sources of data to again show that classroom observations are one source of data for the project, and they're being looked at in combination with all of the other things. So the questionnaires that you can see there, and all of this battery of tests that the learners go through. And obviously the research team will be looking at correlations between what happens in the classroom and the learner results as well. It's not at that stage yet, as you will have been hearing. It's very preliminary. So the only real thing that I'm going to talk about now is what's coming through from these initial classroom observations. So I'm not going to be talking too much about how it's comparing to any of the data that's come through from the learners. Okay, so why classroom observation? Why do we use it? So I mentioned already, it provides us with some kind of picture about what's actually happening in the classroom, and it's really widely used as a measure of teacher quality around the world. It's probably the best way for us to get some direct evidence of what's happening. As I mentioned, it's not perfect. There are lots of limitations. Teachers may sometimes perform when there's an observer in the classroom and do things that they don't normally do with their students. But at least you can kind of get a sense of what teachers can do and what they see potentially as being the best type of practice that you can do in the classroom. So even if they're not doing it all the time, you still get a sort of sense about where they are in terms of the types of practices that they're using. There are ways that we can try to ensure it provides an accurate picture. There's a lot of debate about whether you should announce whether or not you're going to do a classroom observation, for example, or whether you should just turn up on the day. Again, pros and cons with all of that. Obviously, the tools that you use need to be carefully constructed. We need to be sure that we are measuring what we set out to measure, so thinking about the validity of those tools. And the observers who are doing those observations, they need to be trained. They need to know how to use that tool, and so that when one observer goes to a classroom and looks at the lesson, they're not going to come back with a completely different idea of what they saw compared to if somebody else had observed that lesson. So all of these things, with any research that's being done or any kind of observation built into the projects like the ones the British Council does, we try to do as much as we can to ensure that these things happen. I would just say also, I think, that particularly in India, in my experience, and I'd be very pleased if someone in the Q&A, if you disagree with me, to let me know, but from what I've seen, there is quite a lot of emerging data and a lot of existing data about learning outcomes and what learners can or can't do in government schools, you know, with the ACER tests and now the National Achievement Survey and all of those different tests. But I think relatively, there's not so much data about what teachers are doing in the classroom and what the learners are actually themselves doing in the classroom. So I think there is a real need to try to generate a bank of evidence using classroom observations that can be used for all sorts of purposes to take a more evidence-based approach to talking about what teachers do in the classroom in India. We hear a lot of anecdotal stuff. We all have ideas about what happens, but I think really having some hard evidence about it would be a great benefit. Okay. So at the beginning of this year, the British Council, we did a study looking at teacher evaluation, which had two parts to it. And one of the parts was a literature review of how the evaluation of teachers is and can be done. And in that study, which is by Professor Simon Borg, he talks about the different types of observations that can be done. So I just thought I'd talk a little bit, among many other things, I just thought I'd talk a little bit about the types of tools that exist. And then I'll show you the tool that's been used, that we use in our British Council projects, and look at how that was adapted and some things added to the observation tool that's used in the MultiLila project. So in almost every observation tool that I've seen, there will be some information that's collected about class makeup and about the classroom environment, so who's there in the classroom. Many of them will use scales or ratings, so it might be just like level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4, or it might be, like we use in our British Council tool, it might be expectations not met, partially meets expectations, expectations met, exceeds expectations. There's obviously different ways that you can do those scales, but the principle remains the same. Some tools will take a much more qualitative approach, so it's more about recording what the observer is seeing and experiencing in a more text way, rather than kind of assigning scores to different things that the teacher is doing or that the learners are doing. And some tools will look at what is happening at specific periods within the lesson. And you get different combinations of these things with different tools, and there's a lot of debate, again, as I mentioned in this report that we did, a lot of debate about which tools are more accurate or more valid or more reliable, depending on who's using them. But it's interesting to look at, obviously there's different reasons why you might choose to use a different type of tool. And then just to say that some of the tools, they'll look at a whole range of classroom practices, whereas some of them are more specific. They might only be looking at, for example, the classroom management techniques that the teacher is using, or they might only be looking at the type of languages that are being used in the classroom, whereas some are broader. And some will focus mainly on the teacher, and I would say probably in my experience, most tools will focus primarily on what the teacher is doing, with some focus on what the learners are doing. But I've never seen a tool that just looks at what the learners are doing. I'm sure they exist, but they're not as, I don't think they're as common. Okay, so coming on to what we do in the British Council, as you know, Those of you who were yesterday, our director, Alan Gemmell, was talking about some of the work that we do. We work with state governments. We do big, large-scale teacher education projects. And as part of those, we use observation to help us both see what teachers are doing before we start the project, but also to get some sense of how teachers are progressing using the input that they're getting during the project. So with our tools, we do collect that information about classroom environment. We do use scales with ratings, I mentioned, expectations not met, partially met, etc. We get some qualitative data, so it's a bit of a mix. And we do tend to look at a whole range of classroom practices so that we can try to capture all the different things that are going on. And also so that we can look at the things that we are giving input on. Are we seeing more progress in those things than we see in things where we don't give input, just to kind of check if what we're doing is making any difference. We do mainly focus on the teacher, and I think this is a limitation of our tools that we're looking at now to see if we can improve. And another thing that we have really been thinking about over the last few months is about how our tools really have a very limited focus on the use of language in the classroom. And I think this just now is a really good example of how this research project, the MultiLila research project, is helping to inform and develop practice that people are doing in different, parts of the education world in India, because we're learning a lot from what's happening in this project and can apply that back into our tools and into our project work. So I just wanted to emphasize there the sort of back and forth learning that's going on from this sort of project being undertaken. So this is just a very short clip. I'm sorry, those of you at the back, you probably can't see very well, but this is just to give you a sense of what it looks like. So here it is marked as level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4. We do use sometimes that expectations thing that I mentioned. And you can see here, this actual clip is looking at language use. It is primarily focused on the use of English, because that's mainly what we focus our teacher education projects on. But if you can see at the bottom there, we have one indicator which looks at teachers' use of learners' community or home languages. And it goes from the teachers not using their existing linguistic resources at all, right the way through to really effective use of linguistic resources during the lesson in an appropriate way to support their learning. And then obviously there's the ones in between. But that's really, at the moment, the only indicator that we have on our tool that looks at multilingualism in the classroom, or teachers' ability to manipulate that, for want of a better word, that multilingualism as a resource. Okay, moving on. This is just to highlight that although the tool doesn't reflect it, it is something that the British Council is really committed to, this idea of using multilingual approaches as being a really key classroom or professional practice for teachers to develop skills and to be able to demonstrate. This is taken from our framework of continuing professional development. Okay, so this is the tool from the MultiLila research project. I'm sorry, I know it's small for those of you at the back, but just to describe it a little bit, you can see on this slide, this is really looking at the classroom environment and the class makeup. And so looking at things like, is there electricity? Are there displays in the classroom? How many kids are there? How many girls? How many boys? That type of thing. And then this is just a snap of one of the sections. I'm not showing you the whole tool, I'm just showing you what type of things are in there. This was adapted from the British Council's observation tool, and it looks more at general classroom practices that are happening. So you can see here, it's just detailing the learner-centered approach. So there's things like fair treatment of learners, praise and encouragement, use of names, learner engagement. So those general classroom practices. And then this one is a little bit different, and this is something that I'm particularly interested in, because this is what I mentioned before about one of the different types of tools. Here, you've got what's happening in 5-minute increments during the lesson. And there are a set of codes for what the teacher is doing, a set of codes for what the children are doing, and a set of language codes. And so what the observers need to do is, in each 5-minute period, they need to note down the different types of activities done by teachers and learners and the languages used. And within one 5-minute period, obviously, you can have more than one activity. So the kids could be listening and they could be copying text, or there could be a different combination. And also different languages could also be being used. And again, I'll come back to that in a moment when we look at some of the data. Okay, so just to recap then, in terms of the classroom observations for the MultiLila project, the focus of these is really looking at languages that are used in the classroom, which ones are used, how are they used by the learners and by the teacher. It's looking at activity during those 5-minute increments of a 30-minute lesson. And it's looking at teaching practices to see whether eventually to be able to look at whether there is some correlation between the use of certain practices and learning outcomes as measured by the other tests. In this project, it started this year with the observations being done of standard 4 children. So actually a very similar age to the little girl I spoke to at the traffic lights, in schools in Hyderabad, Delhi, and Bihar. And as we've been talking about already, I don't need to repeat all of it, but schools in deprived and very deprived areas, and also the state language medium and English medium. Importantly, it's the same children who are observed twice. So the same children observed this year will also be observed next year when they're in standard 5. And that may or may not be with the same teacher. So in some schools, obviously, depending on the size, the teacher might take both classes or they might move up with them. Whereas in other schools, they would have a completely different teacher. And the lessons that are being observed for each teacher, there are 2 lessons. One is maths, and one is language. And my understanding is that those language lessons, it could be a language lesson in the subject, the state language subject, or it could be in English. And just to note, the data that I'm going to show you in a second, all of the language lesson data is from English language lessons, whether it's in the English medium school or in the Telugu medium school in this case, as the data is from Hyderabad. Okay, so as I said, I've got, very kindly, Professor Simply gave me some data to play with. And I've looked at 10 lessons that were observed in Hyderabad, taught by 5 teachers. So as I mentioned, 1 language lesson, 1 maths lesson, mixture of slum and non-slum schools. They took place at the end of last year. The class size between 20 and 35, and there's a roughly even split of girls and boys, except in 1 school where the proportion was more heavily to do on boys. Very quickly, just about classroom environment. I think it's, we've all seen and been experienced classrooms in Indian government schools, and we know that there's a big range between some have furniture, some don't. All of these classrooms had electricity but no technology in them. 1 classroom had furniture for the students. But what I thought was interesting from looking at this initial data was that regardless of whether the school was Telugu medium or English medium, every single school that had classroom displays, and if I remember correctly, it was 3 of the 5 schools had information displayed. All of that information, all of those displays were in at least 2 languages, Telugu and English. So even in the English medium schools, there was Telugu on the classroom wall, which is interesting in itself. And in one of the schools, Hindi was also used in some of that display material too. So interesting there, even to look at, from a visual point of view, walking into the classroom, you're already seeing that multilingualism straight away. The other thing to note there, I suppose that's interesting, is around resources. Again, very much in line with what we see when we're doing observations within the British Council projects, that it was just the blackboard and the textbook that were being used. There was no additional resources being used by anybody. Okay, so if we're looking at the classroom observation data, and in terms of multilingual practices, there are 3 things that I was starting to look at as I sort of started looking and trying to see where there might be possibly patterns that were emerging. 3 things that came out. So 1 is looking at the opportunities that learners have to practice using language, both in the maths lessons and in the language lessons. And when I say practice using language, obviously for language development, doing choral repetition of words said by the teachers is not going to be as effective as having the opportunity to spontaneously produce language. So I was looking to see if it looked likely that there was much opportunity for children to do that. The other thing, yesterday we talked a bit before about how using strategies for critical thinking, problem solving, and creative thinking help to develop language skills and also those cognitive skills, that they're all interlinked together. So another thing I thought was interesting to have a look at was to what extent the teachers were using strategies that would promote those kinds of skills. And then finally, obviously, the use of language by the teachers and the learners at different points during the lesson, and which different languages were used by them. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk through each of these three things one by one and show you a bit of the data and tell you a little bit about how I went about looking for the patterns. And as we've said already a couple of times, it's very preliminary. This is not a final analysis by any means. There's lots more data to come in, lots more analysis to do. I haven't done any statistical analysis of anything. Okay, so this one is now looking at opportunities that students have or the learners have to practice using language in a spontaneous, productive kind of way. So this one, what I did to get this, to create this chart, was to look at the number of times during the lesson that different activities were counted. So you can see the list of different activities down the left. Again, it's small, I'm sorry. The two that I think are particularly interesting are at the bottom. The one at the bottom is the number of times in a 5-minute period that the learners were listening to the teacher. And as you can see, that is the most common activity for the students over the course of that 30-minute lesson. What's interesting is that that is pretty similar. In fact, they're doing even more listening in the language lessons. Remember, these are English language lessons compared to in the maths lessons, slightly more. The other thing, the other thing that we've seen here, in the second from the bottom line, that's about individual speaking. So the learners having opportunities to talk without doing choral repetition. It's not clear whether it could be an individual student repeating something. That's not clear from the data. But I imagine that, it's still children talking on their own. And what's interesting here is that it looks from this data, again, it's limited, but it looks from this data that in the maths lessons, which is the blue line, there's more chances for individual speaking than in the language lessons, which is a bit strange. So I think that's something that's worth having a look at, again, when more of the data comes in. The third from the bottom one, then, just incidentally, is about repeating and choral response. And as you can see, that's the second most common activity for the learners to be doing in the classroom. None of this, I have to say, none of this is massively surprising. I mean, as Dr. Jingam was saying in his plenary yesterday, he mentioned some of the features of classrooms in India, and this really aligns very closely with that, and also the evidence we have from our British Council observations, and the evidence that we see in the literature elsewhere as well, and anecdotally too. Okay, this one again, this is just about, okay, so this is interesting. So this is looking at the classroom practice of use of pair and group work. So you remember I showed you the tool that looks a bit like this, where there is the chance for the observer to say whether expectations were met against different indicators. So this is what they were looking at when they were looking at pair and group work. It goes from expectations not met, which says that there was no pair and group work used at all, even though it would have been appropriate to use it, and then exceeds expectations to always using pair and group work appropriately, meaningfully and consistently during the lesson. And this one, as you can see here, when you aggregate all of the possible scores, if we give exceeds expectations a score of 4, and we give expectations not met a score of 1, in 10 lessons, the total possible aggregated score is 40, right? 10 lessons times total possible score for the parameter of 4 is 40. So the orange line represents that total possible score. And you can see that actually the scores are relatively high, as in there's a lot of expectations being met on some of the things. That differs a little bit from what we see with the British Council data, but I'm not going to quibble about that, because I think what's interesting is relatively, if you look at all those different things, the thing that is the least satisfactory in terms of meeting expectations is the pair and group work. And again, that's where the children are going to get the opportunity to use language more spontaneously with each other, whatever language it is they might be using. I've shown you that. Okay, this one is now moving on to that second thing I said that I wanted to look at, which is around the strategies that are used in the classroom to promote critical, whoops, it's really annoying. The strategies they use to promote critical thinking or creative thinking. And again, this is using the same approach to looking at the data in terms of the total possible scores. And here again, you can see at the top that the development of learners' creativity, imagination, and critical thinking skills is the one that is least well developed against the expectations according to the indicator. So that's something that is not happening. Again, it's not surprising. You know, that none of this stuff is showing us things that we don't kind of know already, but it's good to have, as I said at the beginning, this hard evidence that is starting to come in to help us to really shape those debates and those discussions without having to rely on anecdotal evidence. Okay, this is also another part of the tool, which is basically a tick box thing to say different strategies that are used in the classroom. The blue line is the maths lessons. The orange line is the language lessons. You can see that all of the lessons used verbal strategies. All of them used visual strategies. The language lessons had a bit more collaborative working than the math lessons did. And a little bit more critical thinking, but there's no evidence of experimental strategies being used, and perhaps more importantly, there's no evidence of creative thinking strategies being used. So again, very early, but it's something I think worth looking into in more detail when all of the data is in. Okay, moving on to the use of language by teachers and learners at different points during the lesson. So for this one, the way that I looked at this data was to look at what was happening during each 5-minute increment during the lesson. And just to explain it to you, hopefully this is going to be clear, if you look at each bar, the colors represent the language or languages that was spoken during that 5-minute increment for each lesson. So if you look at the bottom row, this is in the maths lessons, of which there were 5 observations. In one lesson, in the first 5 minutes, only Telugu was spoken. In all the other lessons, the other 4 lessons, it was a mix of English and Telugu. So grey is a mix of English and Telugu, orange is Telugu only. So what you can see in both cases, sorry, I should also tell you, for those of you who can't see, on the right, the light blue is English only. So the key thing here is that with the teacher's use of language in the maths lessons and the language lessons, there's much more mixing of language than there is sustained language use. I don't know what it means at this stage, but I think it's something very interesting to look at. And again, it says again what we've seen before, that there is a lot of mixing of languages happening in these classrooms. And remember that this data here is showing both the English medium and the Telugu medium schools. So this is by subject. Interestingly, the learner language in both the maths lessons, and again, the single orange and single light blue is single language use. Sorry, the orange and light blue is single language use. The gray is mixing. The green is mixing. The yellow is mixing. You can see that it seems like there's a little bit more sustained language use by the learners, but I think that might be because they are repeating things back to the teacher without having all the filler language around the instructions that the teacher is using. Same in the language lessons. There's mixing of languages, but a little bit more sustained language use in each 5-minute period for the learners in the language lessons. So just to summarize, I realize that's it's a bit confusing to take that in, but just to summarize what I think that is showing and some of the patterns that I think are worth exploring further when we're looking at the subject-wise data. The teachers do a lot of language mixing, but what's not clear is the quality of that language mixing. Because if you are translanguaging, for example, this term about using different languages within a single sentence and fairly fluidly moving between them, there are different ways of using translanguaging and other ways of mixing languages which will be more effective for student learning compared to others. So I think something that the project might be interesting to look at in more depth is what is happening when they're using more than one language in a 5-minute period. Learners mix less, as I said, and perhaps explained by the type of activity they're doing. What was also noticed is that in the English language lessons, there's more sustained use of a single language than there is in maths. But that's the opposite for the teachers, that they use single language more in the maths lesson than they do in the language lesson. Okay, now this is looking at it by medium. So this is in the Telugu medium schools. And remember, this is mixing the language lessons and the maths lessons. So here you can see that the light blue is English only, orange is Telugu, and the gray is mixing English and Telugu together. So again, lots of mixing going on, more single use of just Telugu only during those 5-minute periods by the teacher. This is in the English medium schools, and as you can see, for these teachers, for the teachers teaching these lessons, there's only one example in a 5-minute period and one lesson where there was sustained use of English in a 5-minute period. The rest of the lesson is all mixing of language during those 5-minute periods. Okay, I'm just going to skip straight to the summary of that. So here again, it's very similar to what we looked at when we talked about the subject-wise. Teachers mix languages a lot. We don't know what the quality of that language mixing is. The learners mix less in the English medium lessons, but again, we're not sure if that's because of the activity. And then, interestingly, in the Telugu medium schools, there is more sustained use of single language, Telugu mainly, than in the English medium schools, both for teachers and for learners, but especially for teachers. Lots and lots of language mixing going on by teachers in the English medium schools. I said I wasn't really going to look at the data. I'm not going to look at the data about learners, but I just think from what Savannah and her team reported and also Theo summarized this morning, the initial analyses of the data coming back do show an advantage of the Telugu medium schools in Hyderabad over the English medium schools when it comes to maths, in terms of number recognition and word problems, but there's an advantage for the English medium schools in terms of literacy. Again, too early to make any correlations between them, but I think it's interesting to see how all these patterns are emerging. Okay, just to finish off, thinking about what we can do in future and what we might be able to do with some of that final classroom observation data that comes in when we have the whole lot to look at. As I mentioned, I think there's something really important about better understanding when teachers are using multiple languages, how they use them and for what purpose. Is there something that we can help teachers with to help them do that more effectively? I think the patterns that I've picked out here, it'd be interesting to see whether those patterns hold when you're looking at all of the data that's coming in from the project. I think there's something really important about raising teachers' self-awareness. So if you remember when at the beginning of the presentation, I showed you that quote about teachers self-reporting what they do in the classroom. I think it would be really good to look at what teachers are saying they do or think they do and what the classroom observation data is showing us, because I don't know yet whether those two things will be the same. I know that there is already discussions about using, on the back of the evidence that is coming out of this project, how that can be used to design interventions for teachers, also for head teachers to better understand all of these different issues that are coming up. And talking also to the various stakeholder groups, again, we've been talking about that already, in terms of what can be done to support teaching and learning using, perhaps if there needs to be any changes to policy. I mean, textbooks seems to be an obvious one to me. One thing to note, there's a lot of oral mixing of language in the English medium schools. But in every class in the English medium schools, as reported from this data, the textbooks are in English only. So that means the children are hearing at least 2 languages regularly during the class. But when they're looking at their textbook, there's no language support there to help them with the English if that's their weaker language. So I think there's something there as well about looking at how maybe those two things could be brought together better. Finally, again, and as I said, for us at the British Council, doing projects, being involved in projects like this and working with the universities, I'm not a researcher. We don't conduct the research. We don't usually get a chance to do any kind of analysis. But I think as we are seeing the results that the teams are generating, it's really useful for us to be able to pump that back into our work and to use that to talk to the people that we work with as well, to see how we can improve what we're doing, but also what's happening in the classrooms. And as I said, I think we need to think quite carefully about how we talk about multilingual practices and also how we try to measure them and see what's happening in the classes that we have access to through our projects. One thing I've thought about as we're doing this, a lot of the questions that I had as I was going through the data, I wondered whether they could have actually been answered if, well, they could have been answered in many cases, if we had videos of observation. And again, in that report that I mentioned at the beginning that we did around teacher evaluation, video observation is becoming a very big thing in some countries in terms of being able to see what's happening in the classroom and helping teachers to see what they are doing themselves. So that's something I think we might think about a bit further too. I've already talked about improving our tools and developing awareness. I think all of those things are really important and things that we will continue to work on. Okay, that's it from me. I've put my email address there if anyone wants to get in touch about any of the things I've talked about. I've also taken the liberty of putting the links to those, the publication I mentioned around teacher evaluation, as well as the general review of the literature around teacher evaluation globally. We also looked quite closely at what's being done in India with regards to evaluation teaching. There's a lot of stuff in there around classroom observation. Not much about multilingual practices, but a lot about classroom observation. So do take a look at those if you are interested in looking at further information. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Amy. We'll now be inviting questions from the audience. So if you could just raise your hand and also tell your name when you ask a question.
Amy, hi, I'm Darpan this side, Darpan Majumdar.
Hi.
My question to you, Amy, is that as of now, what kind of technology you're using in getting the data, if you can throw some light, and is it is anything real time, or if you can sort of throw some insights, and if not, what are the plans of using some sort of technology to do data and as well kind of analysis for the same?
Okay, so are you interested to know specifically about the project or generally about the British Council or both? Okay, so in the project, my understanding is that it's done on paper and pen, and then the data is uploaded into Excel, and then the analysis will be done through various tools to analyze the data. And in fact, with most of our project work that the British Council does when we do observation and we do our monitoring and evaluation, obviously, it's a bit of a different process, a different focus to this research. The purpose of doing it is slightly different. But to answer your question, we don't use a lot of technology. It's something we've talked about I've been here for 5 years. We've definitely been talking about it for 5 years. And it's something, we keep saying we need to try and improve this and streamline it. It does take a lot of time to input that data and then, you do the analysis. So it's something we're very interested in, and we want to try to improve. But the answer is not much.
Hello. I have two questions. First, you said in your presentation that apart from the quantitative data, there was some qualitative data also that you collected. So what are some of these qualitative data that you collected? And what should be the ideal proportion of this qualitative data as compared to the quantitative data in the total research? First question. And the second question is, you also talked about the strategies to promote critical and creative thinking. Mm-hmm. So what are these strategies basically? And
okay.
What strategies basically can be employed to do so?
Okay, two quite different questions. If I forget the second one when I'm answering the first, you'll have to say it again. Okay, the first question in terms of qualitative data, I haven't seen any qualitative data from the project, but I do know that on the tool there was a space for the observers to write some information in. So I think for this project, and again, the team, correct me if I'm getting this wrong, but the main focus is on the quantitative data and using those indicators to be able to make descriptive choices about what's happened, is that the right phrase, but based on what they're seeing in the lesson against the indicators which describe, just to find the closest match to what they describe and doing it that way. The qualitative data, I think, is really just to try and give the observers an opportunity to say if something wasn't quite right, if the data doesn't capture something in quite the right way, or if something they wanted to add that isn't captured by the tool, some situation that happened, maybe in the middle of the class, everything was disrupted and they want to make a note, that kind of thing. But to my knowledge, Yanthi, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's, the focus is mainly on the quantitative side. in our projects that we do at the British Council, we do use some qualitative data, but to be honest with you, we use that to choose some quotes that come out of it to try and kind of color the quantitative data, but our primary analysis is also done on the quantitative stuff. Whether that's right or wrong, I think it depends on what you want to do with that data at the end of the day. So how you want to be able to present that. And when you're talking about very large numbers, as we will be eventually with this project and we do with our British Council projects, dealing with that amount of qualitative data is very challenging, particularly when you're not using any technology. And I think, yeah, it's just, we've chosen to go down that road. The second question was around critical thinking and creativity and developing strategies.
The strategies to promote creative and critical thinking. So what can be some of these strategies?
Okay, it's a big question. I could do a whole nother presentation on that. But I think one thing to point out, which I think is really interesting, is that when we talk about English language teaching, and I know some of you in this room are English language teachers or you have a background in that, a lot of the strategies that we talk about in English language teaching, or in fact in any language teaching, using pair and group work, what else have we got? Asking questions of the students, getting them to work on projects as an opportunity to practice language in different ways. All of those strategies actually also will help to develop things like critical thinking and creativity. So working on projects to develop language skills can be quite creative and can develop those creativity skills in the students. Using answering questions and engaging with each other and challenging each other through debates, etc., that can help to develop critical thinking and problem solving. There are lots of other things that can be done to develop those skills as well. But I think it's interesting to look at how language learning speaks to the development of those what we call 21st century or core skills as well, that they are interlinked. If you're developing language skills, you are often developing those skills at the same time, or maybe there's an argument that you should be in order to be successful. We can talk more about it at lunch.
Hello.
Do we have more questions, if I can just see?
Just, Amy, I was trying to look at the indicators used for various parameters, and I'm just trying to get clear how those indicators might have been developed. And particularly, I was looking at one related to group work and pair work. Mm-hmm. You had level 1, 2, 3, 4, and the 4 says always uses group and pair work. So in what sense that kind of indicator was developed? Was it an ideal expectation that level 4 means always using, or is it benchmarked against something?
I think it says always uses pair work and group work appropriately. I think it says that. I'd have to check, but I know that on our tool that's what it says. It's not a suggestion that in every class, at every point during the lesson, the kids should be working in pairs or groups. Obviously, there's times where it needs to be in plenary or the teacher needs to give instruction of some sort of input. I think what you have highlighted, though, is something, and it goes back to what I said at the beginning about in terms of reliability, that the people who are doing the observations need to have the same idea about what appropriate pair work and group work is. And that's something that we, in our project work, we try really, really hard to standardize how people will interpret those indicators. Because you could write as much detail as you wanted. You'd end up with like a 100-page tool, but you could write as much detail as you wanted. You're still going to get some subjectivity coming into it. So there is just certainly something there about, making sure that everyone's got the same idea about what they're looking for. Obviously, the fewer number of observers that are doing the observations, the less of an issue that's going to be. But yeah, does that answer your question?
Thank you.
May I ask you the question now?
Sure. Hi.
Yeah, I'm looking at the importance and the value of observation data in relation to the project, the context of the project. And I think it's a wonderful, wonderful source of data which can be used to explain all the results that, for example, we saw yesterday. Because there were lots of questions put up by all the 3 teams. Even Yanti, for example, in her presentation, we don't know what this means, kind of thing. And I think observation data is the one which is going to be able to account for, to a large extent, not that single observations are, one-off observations of a teacher with students is going to help much, but still, I think that's where really the crux of the whole thing lies, and that's what is important. But I think looking at the work done so far, somehow I have one question about, I think what Amol hinted at now. When the observer sits in the class and makes a lot of inferences about what's going on, whether it's good or not, and that's what the analyzer like you, for example, gets, then there is a slight problem.
Yeah.
Because the observer is already making the inference based on so-called what's observed. So when somebody says, now is it appropriate, 4-4-4 or 3-3-3. Now I'm also wondering whether it happens at the end of the class, this sort of judging, rating it, or when. And in order to support that, I think there has to be a lot of descriptive data available on the paper, so that, you can cross-check and so on. So I think it's a balance of, taking down notes and also arriving at some kind of a rating, which is available for closer observation, closer scrutiny later on, and so on. So I think later on maybe we'll need to look at this aspect more carefully.
I agree with you. And that is actually a change that we made with our tools in the British Council projects, that we started to, we flipped it. So we said to all of our observers, the training consultants who go into the classroom, write a narrative about what you see. And then when you go back, that when the lesson is finished, then make your judgment on the different parameters. And I think I agree that that's a better way of doing it, but not least because you then have some evidence of exactly what they saw is written out in a bit more detail, so you can go back and cross-check. In this case, I don't know enough about how the observers were trained and what they did when they went into the classroom. As we've said, this is really early stuff, and I think there is still, the opportunity to talk to the research assistants and discuss further about how that's happening, and maybe bring in some more of that description. There is some instructions on the front of the tool about when different bits are to be filled in. If my memory serves me correct, I haven't got the tool with me now, but if my memory is correct, the practices bit is done after, and the focus during the lesson is on the 5-minute increments. So, one challenge around this tool, there's a lot of stuff happening, right, for these observers. So they've got to do the 5-minute increment thing, and then they've also then got to think about the classroom practices. They've done the classroom environment thing they do right at the beginning of the lesson. But I agree. The idea is to try and collect as much information as possible so you get this kind of varied picture. But it does present challenges. And I think, just one more point to add to that, I think with all data from this type of thing, where there is this element of subjectivity, and also you're never going to get as much detail as you want, you're going to answer some questions, but you're also going to generate other questions. And I think we have to, almost resign ourselves to the fact that that's always going to be the case.
On language issues, we get on language use, we get a very clear picture, on, which languages are used in what sequence, and also the extent of use. It's minimalist in the sense we still don't know the nature of translanguaging that's happening, and how that translanguaging helping in conceptual understanding, or generating a conceptual dialogue rich enough to help children develop concepts. That, of course, we cannot capture in just half an hour's time. So I agree with you. But I have one ethical issue here. So I thought I want to ask you that. Mm-hmm. That, we do just 2 observations per teacher, isn't it? And we also pick up randomly. We haven't used any other basis for selection of any two half-an-hour classes. And then in that class, suppose some group work doesn't happen, or pair work doesn't happen, or critical, some group work where we raise some possibilities of critically looking at concepts, or our engagement with concepts doesn't happen. And then we say that, these were not happening. Mm-hmm. And, then we try to say that, okay, we admit that we have only we have only 2 observations.
Yeah.
And we are speaking on the basis of that observations.
Yeah.
But we are clearly generating a huge picture about the school and the teachers, you know.
Yeah.
And is it not an ethical issue? Because we are not.
Yeah, it is an
taking
issue.
the-
It's a limitation. And I
Yes,
think
so
we just
how
have to
do
be
we-
clear about the limitations. I mean, you know, the obvious way to mitigate that particular thing is to do more observations. But it's not feasible to do in the project, this project. And it presents challenges for other projects as well to try to increase. We have real problems doing as many observations as we need to do. I mean, we do them, but
Maybe-
it's difficult.
Yeah, I thought maybe underreporting will be a better thing. Like, I don't know, I work on critical education, so I'm so scared to comment, you know, based on just
Yeah, no, I mean,
30 minutes
for me, to be
observations,
honest with
yeah.
you, for me, the thing that stands out the most and the thing that I think, you know, the thing that I think we need, I mean, we need to look at all of this in more detail. The thing that is very clear to me from this, even limited data, is the language mixing that is going on. Again, it's nothing new, you know, I'm not saying anything no one's heard before, but it's great to see that, you know, it's starting to emerge as this very clear pattern from the data, and we will look to see if that
That's a
continues.
very
And the
good
other
data.
things
That's
too,
a very
you know,
good data,
let's
yeah.
see. Anthony?
Can I just say in relation to this, there are 2 issues I want to raise. The first is that you talked about limited data, and of course it's limited data, and it is 10 lessons that are included there. But if you think about the number of children that are exposed to these lessons, then you get roughly 400 children. And I think that when we talk about the learner-centered approach, I think this is what we need to keep in mind, because each teacher is going to teach not just one child, but at least 40, right? So that's about the power of the data you present. The second thing is, in this project, we were mostly interested in this language using classroom because we wanted, and that should be fine. And the third point I want to say in response to Minetti's concern is that the teachers that were observed were willing to be observed, and they were not willing to be observed in most cases on the day that we arrived, but on the second day. So they wanted to prepare for that, and therefore they are supposed to bring the best possible practice, I think,
Yeah.
as far as they're concerned. So I think in that sense, we're getting the better picture
Yeah.
in what we have.
And also, just to add to that, I think, remember that in this project, we're not actually looking at teachers. We're looking at what the learners are experiencing. So we will be looking in the project at 4 lessons that those children experience. 2 this year, 2 next year. And if in those 4 lessons, there's a pattern showing that there's really not much pair working group, or, you know, these things we talked about, then, you know, yes, there are limitations in terms of the numbers of observations, but I think still there's enough to be able to say, you know, this is what it's looking like, right? Okay, I really think we need to finish, right? Because we need a break.
We've got
Just
2
one-
more questions that
Okay,
we can
one more
take
question.
in. So
Yep.
I've already picked out who they're going to be.
Yeah, yeah.
So there's one at the back, Snehal.
One suggestion, in fact. I'm Snehal. I
Hi.
right now work with the Right to Education Forum, and earlier a researcher for Open University Study, whose report was launched last evening. Knowing the work that British Council has already done with Open University, regarding the technology and everything, there is, in one project there are lots of tablets available. And the suggestion that I'm trying to point out right now is, what we found best was to audio record, at least audio record, all the classroom being observed, and if funding permits, then actually transcribe the whole classroom transaction of the half an hour or 40 minutes, whatever it is. Because that transcription can form the basis of so many peer review questions and so many other things that need to be answered later on. And videos of at least 5 minutes duration, something interesting is going on. And even with a simple handheld mobile, if the researcher has, or the tablets that, of course, the British Council already has in one of the projects with the Open University, as I know, I used to know 2 years back. So at least 5 minutes videos and some photographs. The way Mr. Dheer yesterday showed those videos, that would really help and won't take much time, hopefully.
Okay.
So going forward, the rich data that can be
Yeah, no, and as I mentioned, that's something that we've been exploring, if we can use more video. To be honest, I mean, a lot of it comes down to time and how much time we have available to review all of this information. And just to be clear, as I said, when we do our observations in the projects, it's evaluating and trying to check and see what's happening. It's not so much, it's not as detailed in terms of this research at looking and going into detail about the patterns. So, you know, yes, I absolutely agree. It would be great to try and do more of that if we can. Thank you very much. I think we're going to finish now. Yeah.
Thank you, Amy.